Homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm, or welcome back. I am going to make some canned potatoes. We are kind of doing all thing potatoes right now. It is the 17th of March. Happy St. Patrick's Day. And the potatoes that we grew last year that have been sitting in my garage in kind of sort of cold storage, but you know, depends on the time of year and what the outside temperature is doing. My garage never actually freezes, but it does vary quite a bit in temperature depending on what the outside temperature is. They were all starting to sprout. And so I've spent the last, probably at least 10 years trying to figure out how to get potatoes that store long-term. And the short version of this, I have a blog post on this that goes into much more detail, but the short version is buy late season potatoes. Late season potatoes are gonna hold way better than the early or the mid-season potatoes. And then in my experience, yellow or white potatoes last way longer than the red potatoes and the blue potatoes. Blues are always the first to start sprouting, and then red potatoes, and then the white potatoes. I've had good luck with Elba. I'll put a couple of other varieties up on the screen that seem to have stored well. And then there's always the question of, do you want like fluffy potatoes that make really good baked potatoes, or do you want waxy potatoes that make good boiled and mashed potatoes? And you can work that out. There's many options. And I've done several deep dives into potatoes on my YouTube channel and also on my blog. But all of the potatoes are starting to sprout, and we are not going to grow potatoes this year. So my goal is to take everything that we grew last year that we hadn't eaten our way through in the winter and freeze it or can it. I'm doing a lot of freezing, and I do have a video on how I freeze potatoes. So I freeze them as hash browns. I freeze them as chunks that can then be roasted in a toaster oven or in an oven. And I freeze them as French fries so that they're basically like an Ore-Ida style French fry where they're partially fried and then frozen, and then you just get them out and throw them on a cookie sheet and bake them, and you have baked French fries. All three of those ways work great, and we find we use those a lot more than we do canned potatoes. But I also do like canned potatoes. A lot of people don't like the texture of canned potatoes. They expect them to be a potato texture when you've boiled it in water and you're gonna mash it, and they definitely are not. There's something about the pressure canning process that gelatinizes the starch in those potatoes and makes it surprisingly firm. And so they're really good cut up and just fried in a skillet for breakfast. We often do that with bacon and some onions and peppers and just have like a kind of a fried hash, but they're not great for mashed, which I think is what most people are imagining they would be good for. We love them for camping because it's so quick and easy versus bringing whole fresh potatoes and then trying to cook them when you're in a camping situation. So I always have some canned potatoes on my shelf as well. And this book, which is the all new Ball book of canning and preserving, which is definitely my very favorite canning book of Balls. I have all of the Ball books, and this one is by far my favorite because it's a little more progressive. It's a little more 2000 forward in terms of eating and what's in here. And it has some really great pages that are like this one, where you take basically one ingredient and it shows you different variations on that ingredient. And so I've never done this before. They have 3 different canned potato recipes in here. One is herb potatoes, which has rosemary and thyme and chicken stock. One is chipotle potatoes, which has chipotle peppers, fresh cilantro, garlic, and chicken stock. And then one is Mediterranean potatoes, which has oregano or rosemary, some lemon zest, and some chicken stock. They all are 2.5 pound recipes, which is gonna make you 2 quart or 4 pints per recipe. So I'm gonna try all 3. This has kind of been my theme this year. I did a similar thing with all the baked bean recipes that are out there. I'm trying to narrow down like what really is my go-to recipe, what's my favorite recipe. And so I'm gonna just do all 3 and see which one we like better. And then the other thing to know about these kind of recipes is the spices that are in them are interchangeable. And so if you hate rosemary and you wanna do something else in the same amounts. So you can change out the different herbs and spices that are in here pretty easily as long as you stick to the same amounts. The density change is not going to be an issue, which is usually what you're concerned about with pressure canning, is am I changing the density of this recipe by changing out an ingredient, and changing out spices and herbs is not going to make any difference. But I'm going to make all 3 of these, and we'll have them for camping this summer. We're planning on doing a lot of camping this summer. So I'm going to start out with 2.5 times 3, so 7.5 pounds of potatoes. This particular variety is called Pinto. I love this variety just because it's very fun. It's similar to a Yukon Gold. It's kind of a waxy yellow potato on the inside. These are really prolific. They do very well for me here. And you can see they are just starting to get a little bit wrinkled. We did take all of the sprouts off of everything that we had here. And then I've got, well, this is actually a different potato altogether, but any green spots that I have on here, I'm going to take off as well. When you're canning potatoes, you do need to take the skins off, which is the other reason why I prefer frozen. We like potato skins. There's a lot of nutrition in there, and it saves a ton of time if you don't have to take the skins off. But when you're canning potatoes, you do need to take the skins off because there's a lot of bacterial load and dirt load on those skins that increases the risk when you're canning. And so you need to peel everything in order to can potatoes. So first I'm going to start out with getting peeling, and then I'm just going to make all of these recipes and see which one we like the best later in the summer. Maybe I'll do a follow-up video on our favorite potatoes, our favorite baked bean recipes, also tasting the kiwi wine that I did, because those are all going to be follow-up tasting videos coming this summer. Maybe I'll do them all together, who knows. But canning different kinds of herb potatoes, let's get started. So I'm just going to peel these. This is my favorite OXO potato peeler. And people that peel towards themselves, I do not understand you. I always peel away from myself like this. And I've tried the Y-shaped peelers instead. They just don't do it for me. One of the things about these recipes is they're very specific about how many pounds go into each jar. And you need to pay attention to that. And size of the potato chunks is also going to be important here. You want your pieces to be under 2 inches for the same reason, because if they're too thick, the heat doesn't penetrate, and that's not what the recipe was calculated for. So I've got all of my ingredients prepped and then all of my potatoes divided up. And this is 2.5 pounds before they were peeled, not after. So first we're doing the herbed potatoes. This is 2.5 pounds of potatoes before peeling, 2 teaspoons of non-iodized salt. I'm using canning and pickling salt. You can use whatever you've got. A teaspoon of black pepper, a teaspoon of dried rosemary, and a teaspoon of dried thyme. I'm going to do multiple jars in one batch, and so I'm just going to prep these ahead of time. So giving everything a nice toss and trying to make sure that everything is stuck on those potatoes and evenly distributed. This is probably the easiest and probably the most versatile of all of the recipes. Second recipe, Chipotle, starting with the same 2.5 pounds of potatoes. We're going to add 2 teaspoons of non-iodized salt, 2 teaspoons of chipotle powder, a half a cup of fresh cilantro, and 4 teaspoons of fresh minced garlic. I'm really excited to use these in a chorizo and potato taco. I think they're going to be great for that when I'm camping. Again, giving everything a nice toss, toss, toss. And side note, when you see these kind of canning recipes and they're calling for white potatoes, they just mean as opposed to sweet potatoes. And then the third one is Mediterranean. So our 2.5 pounds of potatoes, 2 teaspoons of salt again, a teaspoon of black pepper, 2 teaspoons of oregano, and they did give the option of rosemary as another option here. And then 2 teaspoons of fresh lemon zest and a cup of fresh chopped onion and a cup of fresh chopped bell peppers. And so again, giving everything a good toss. I'm not really sure what I'm going to do with these. These I have the least idea in terms of actually using them in dinners later. So everything is prepped and ready to go. And then I ended up using, you can do these in quart jars or pint jars. I didn't have very many pint jars that were wide mouth. And for recipes that are chunky like this, I really prefer a wide mouth jar to a regular mouth jar, although I could have used the regular mouth and been okay. I'm trying to evenly distribute not just the potatoes, but also the other parts of this recipe into the jars. So I'm trying to kind of add some of it as I go, pushing things down a little bit so that everything fits in, and just looking to get this as even as possible. A little bit left over here getting on the top. And then all 3 of these recipes, you can top them with a vegetable broth or a chicken stock. I went ahead and used chicken stock. I'm using some Better Than bouillon here. Giving the jars a tap just to kind of make sure everything's down below that 1-inch headspace line. And then because the bouillon can kind of settle into the bottom, I'm trying to make sure that I've got it evenly distributed there. Out of 4 cups of bouillon that I mixed, I had about 1 1/3 cups left over. So no going in, you're going to need at least 3 cups of bouillon in order to do 2 quart jars. Wiping my rims. of course, using new caps. And when I'm pressure canning, I like to give a little bit tighter than finger tight on these, just because there's always some siphoning, and I think it cuts down a little bit on the siphoning and gives you a better chance of a good seal if you've given that just a slightly higher twist. You don't want it so tight that it's gonna buckle the lid, so it's a little tricky. Second set of quart jars here. This is the Chipotle. Same process, trying to get everything as evenly distributed as I can. And all of these process for the same processing time, which is 35 minutes for pints or 40 minutes for quarts. So same processing time, whether there was raw onion and peppers in there, whether there was fresh herbs in there, or whether it was just dried herbs and salt and pepper, which makes me think that you can do some mixing and matching here. So I think you could probably add some fresh onion to a different recipe, and as long as you use the processing time, I think you would come out okay. Again, giving everything a little bit of a twist to release any air bubbles, a little bit of a tap just to make sure, and then measuring our 1-inch headspace using our headspace tool here. And this is going to be the first batch that goes into the canner for 40 minutes. And then I saved the pint jars for a second run. So into the canner it goes. If you're not familiar with pressure canning, I have quite a few videos of pressure canning. I'm not going to go through all the details. Every canner is a little bit different. Read the instructions for yours. On mine, you put 3 quarts of water in the canner, put the lid on, let it steam for 10 minutes, then you put the pressure valve on and let it come all the way up to the pressure that it needs to be at, and then start your timer. And then when it's done timing, you turn the heat off and let it naturally pressure release back to 0 on its own. So you're not releasing that pressure ahead of time. This is batch number 3. I'm getting everything ready, but I'm not actually adding the hot broth. These are raw pack. The standard recipe, if you're just canning potatoes without any of the spices and herbs, are a hot pack where you heat the potatoes ahead. And so these were okay to just sit basically at room temperature until I was ready to run my second batch. And then I just reheated my chicken broth so that it was hot when I poured it into those jars. So here we are, 10 pounds of pressure for 40 minutes. And see how everything is bubbling, even though I've taken the lid off the counter, the pressure is completely released. This is completely normal. If you have never pressure canned before, this may freak you out. It's completely normal, and sometimes it will continue to boil for up to an hour. So I like to take my lid off, let it sit in the counter with the lid off for about 10 minutes before I pull the jars out, because I think it helps. I think sometimes when you don't get a good seal, it's from a temperature shock from going from really, really hot, what inside the canner is 240 degrees, down to 70 degrees a little bit too fast. And so I like to let it sit. So here's batch number 3. And again, these are pint jars instead of quart jars. And I totally think you could play around with the different herbs and spices that were in this and not just do rosemary and thyme, although I really like rosemary and thyme and potatoes, so I think this is going to be pretty fabulous. And I did have some siphoning with the first batch, and I didn't change the water out, I just topped it off. And so you'll see a little bit of discoloration in the water here. That is from the siphoning from the first batch. It wasn't terrible, but I did have some. My experience with canning potatoes is siphoning is just a given. Like, you're not gonna get away without having some kind of siphoning. Second batch is done. Pulling those out. Those are also bubbling still in the jar, and I'm going to let everything sit until they're completely cool, which is going to be 8 to 12 hours at a minimum. Here you can see a little bit of residue here. And then this is the next morning. Everything's sealed. I had one jar I wasn't sure if it was going to seal or not, but it did. The one with the most siphoning was the one with the fresh onions and peppers in it, and I think that's just because fresh fruits and vegetables have a lot of air trapped in them, and when you bring them up to a pressure canning situation, they release a lot of that air. The Chipotle, some siphoning. You can see I'm down an inch or so from where the fill line originally was, but not too bad. And then the herbed potatoes, also some siphoning, but not as much as the Chipotle. So the least amount of siphoning was on the just simple herbed potatoes. But this is gonna be a fun experiment. I'm excited to taste all of these. Give this recipe a try, tribe. How would you eat the Mediterranean potatoes with the oregano and the lemon zest? Leave me your suggestions in the comments. Thanks for watching, Tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.